Hi, it's Dwyer. It is August the 3rd, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, yesterday at 140 pounds in Chicago, as premium subscribers know, Oscar Duarte delivered for us. But the fight was competitive, and it gave us one of the most compelling boxing moments on television this year. Right? The referee was laissez-faire. For those of you who believe that Daniel Dubois' punch on Alexander Usyk was illegal in the first fight, the shot to the stomach, what I want them to do is to look at the early parts of this fight between Kenneth and Oscar Duarte. Right? You're going to see several punches on the belt line that the ref lets go. Then punches started straying a little bit lower than that. But understand, you had several punches landed, particularly by Oscar Duarte in this fight, that were lower than the Daniel Dubois punch in the first Usyk fight. Let me also make a point, too, how important it is. Usyk's unbeaten as I make this video. Right? Maybe he would have gotten off the canvas and gone on to beat Daniel Dubois. Right? But a moment like that, just like Gene Tunney and the long count involving Jack Dempsey in the 20s, which we're talking about almost 100 years later. A moment like that changes a lot of legacies. Right? Just to understand, if Dubois beats Usyk off that punch, right? If Usyk gets up, doesn't have 5 minutes, only has 10 seconds, and can't make it through, right? Dubois would have beaten the man who beat Tyson Fury. Right? Usyk would have a loss on his resume. The entire lay of the land would be different. Right? Not just Usyk's record, but the legacies of the people around him. Just understand that didn't happen. That punch was ruled a low blow, and then history played out the way it did. Usyk's down for 5 minutes. He gets up. A disheartened Daniel Dubois goes on to get stopped in the fight. Doesn't even go the distance. Now we don't even remember that moment where Usyk's unbeaten legacy was on the line. Well, here you had compelling TV. Duarte's punches started straying a little bit lower than the belt line. So, close fight. How close? Folks, the live telecast does not lie. The referee, later in the fight, tells Duarte, hey, no more low blows. Right? You can't do that, basically. So then Duarte goes to his corner. The fight is so close that Duarte's trainer, who's the current trainer for Bam Rodriguez, right? A trainer who at one point was training after the scandal, not before it, Antonio Margarito, right? This is a trainer who at one point trained AJ for one of the fights against Usyk. Robert Garcia, right? You know, who has been trainer of the year in the past, longtime boxing guy, isn't overly excitable, experienced, has been in the trenches many times. In the corner, the mic catches Garcia, who's currently Virgil Ortiz's trainer, telling Oscar Duarte, no more low punches. Right? In essence, you can't afford to lose a point here. This fight's too close. Folks, it's compelling. Somebody needs to put the video up here online. It's compelling video. Let me point out that networks in Garcia fights, particularly after the Virgil Ortiz-Boachuk fight, where, Garcia basically tells Ortiz, who's unbeaten as I make this video, you can't lose another round. Right? Networks have to put mics in every corner, manned by Robert Garcia. Right? Viewers want to know the truth. Robert Garcia is telling you the truth. If you didn't understand that Duarte was being significantly tested by Kevin Sims, you were jolted into that reality by trainer Robert Garcia's comments to his own fighter between rounds. Right? So let me just say, I thought that was jarring. Let's get edgy now. And I thought Duarte won the fight. Understand, they landed, according to CompuBox, the same number of punches, but Duarte is throwing many more. Right? And Duarte is landing the harder punches at the higher rate. Right? He landed 60-something more power shots than Sims. Right? So just understand, Duarte, the heavier punches, matches volume. He's the one on the front foot. He won the fight. Right? But let's get edgy. And I'm not alleging, I'm not insinuating that anyone here is cheating in any way, shape, or form. But just understand, Garcia is like a race car driver. You know how they have sponsors and they'll have, patches from different sponsors on their race car outfits. Well, Garcia comes in, he's wearing a hat. It's for a car dealership in town where he is. He has things on his, trainer's outfit. Right? He's sponsoring, a law firm was on the back of his outfit. Importantly, in a fight involving a fighter, his fighter, who looked muscle bound. Folks, this was a fight at 140. You were looking at Oscar Duarte and you thought, my goodness, this guy has a lot of muscles for 140. At the beginning of the fight, even the broadcast team, and they were excellent. It's Mora, it's Mannix, right? They were excellent, but they were talking about how wide, and it was wide, Duarte's back looked. Right? Well, understand, on Garcia's gear was SNAC, S-N-A-C. Right? Now, understand, Victor Conti and SNAC were, back in the day, the people involved in the baseball steroids scandal. Understand how big that was. They were supplying Barry Bonds with the cream and the clear. Right? Now, I can flatly tell you, Bonds is arguably the best hitter I've ever seen in my life. Right? I can tell you that Bonds, some years, and it's preposterous, had an on-base percentage over 500. It's not just all home runs with Bonds. Right? Bonds was an elite hitter. Right? I'm not sure if I've seen anybody else with an on-base percentage over 500. There's a game where Bonds came up with the bases loaded. The opposing manager was Buck Showalter. Showalter instructed his pitcher to walk Barry Bonds with the bases loaded. They walked Bonds with the bases loaded. A run scored. Understand, that was the right call. It's one of the best managerial decisions I know of, because Showalter's team went on to win. Showalter realized that it was better walking Bonds than it was allowing Bonds to hit with the bases loaded. Bonds' slugging percentage was off the page. Right? Just understand what an on-base percentage means. If Bonds has an on-base percentage around 500, right, chances are he's going to get on base anyway. Right? Just, he has a 50% chance of getting on base. Let's make it 100% with only one run scoring. Right? That's the dominance of Bonds on snack products. Now, the cream and the clear were ruled illegal to the point where Barry Bonds, the great hitter, is not in baseball's Hall of Fame. This is a 7-time MVP. Right? This is a guy who, by any metric, if he's eligible, would get in the Hall of Fame. Great fielder, a 40-40 guy, great base runner, right? And, of course, dominant hitter. But the cream and the clear were that scandalous, right? Just understand, other guys who took the cream and the clear aren't in the Hall of Fame either, right? Gary Sheffield arguably should be a Hall of Famer. He's not a Hall of Famer. So here you have Garcia with a muscle-bound fighter, and Garcia has snack among the patches or ads on his jacket. Right now, let's go further here. Victor Conte, fascinating individual, was part of Tower of Power here in the Bay Area. Big-time band from years ago, right? He apparently decided to branch out into the world of, snack, right? And he, has legal products on the market that you can get on Amazon, right? Just understand that Victor Conte is the best authority in my eyes on talking about training and supplements. Whenever something goes wrong in the sport, right, some esteemed athlete runs afoul of clenbuterol rules and things like that, Victor Conte will give an interview. Many of them are here online. His last name is spelled Conte. Right? He's back from the penalties he endured, giving athletes the cream and the clear. Right? Revolutionary at the time. Steroids you did not inject. Performance-enhancing drugs you did not inject. Importantly, Conte now talks about what might be the rage in boxing. You need to pay close attention to it. Right now, this is a guy who legally is helping out superstar trainers like Robert Garcia, to the point where Garcia has snack on his clothes on a televised boxing show, right? Just understand, Victor Conte has given interviews where he has talked about EPO. And this is important for other sports, because in other sports, you have some wrestlers claiming that they used the same drug guys that highly thought of athletes have used in the past, right? And this story's been unreported. So we have VADA. Can VADA be beaten? Victor Conte claims that while VADA is very good and knows when to test people, right? They'll show up at your house on a holiday ready to test you, that they're up against a lot because EPO clears your system quickly. EPO is a drug that many cyclists used in races like the Tour de France, right? Look up the drug scandal in cycling. And EPO clears your system quickly because your body has some EPO. You're only deemed to be illegal if you're over a certain line, if it's clear that you've been artificially enhanced. And I need for folks to understand what Victor Conti is saying is that if you microdose, you can have an advantage in the amount of red blood cells in your body, but not enough of an advantage where you fail a test, right? Well, let me just say this from a gambler's perspective, and I'm not alleging anyone's EPOing here, anyone's microdosing here. All I'm trying to do is to highlight the fact that you see Garcia, he has snack on his clothes. He's open about working with snack, SNAC, to help his fighters. He's also vocal in saying that the drug testing rules need to be enforced, right? And so this is a guy who's not trying to break rules. But I need for folks to understand that boxing has reached a point, it reached this point several years ago, where fighters are taking supplements to keep themselves in peak condition. Now, when you see a muscle-bound fighter like an Oscar Duarte, he's 29. You need to understand that there's going to be a time in the fight. I believe gamblers need to consider this. I'm not worried about the rest of the world here. I'm worried about gamblers trying to get an edge on the casino, right? You see Duarte, and keep in mind, I bet on Duarte. You see Duarte, he's muscle bound in around round 6 to 8. Somewhere in that range. It could be round 6, it could be round 7, it could be round 8. A lot of it depends on the fitness of the fighter, the age of the fighter. When you see a muscle-bound guy like this, he's going to have a dip in energy level somewhere in those rounds. In other words, muscle-bound guys, muscles burn energy faster than fat does. Right? The benefit to being a Larry Holmes is that you could go 15 rounds. Right? A guy who has fat on him and stuff like that. When you see a guy like Duarte, where he has next to no fat, where you can see all the muscles in his arm, for example, you understand that he is going to fade badly somewhere in the 6 to 8 round range, right? Let me say this too. There was a fight involving 3 heavyweight champions, right? Well, 3 guys who would end up having the belt at different times, right? Vitaly Klitschko was in the corner of his brother, Vladimir Klitschko. And Vladimir Klitschko, who himself was somewhat muscle-bound, who faded badly in the very rounds I'm talking about, against Layman Brewster. Look at the ending of that fight, the first fight that they had, right? Just to understand that Vitaly Klitschko, who wasn't muscle-bound like his brother, was telling his brother during his brother's fight against Anthony Joshua that Joshua's muscles were going to betray him in exactly the part of the fight I'm talking about. Right? You know, the feeling was, okay, these muscle-bound guys, they're locomotives. Right? Straight out of the train station, early in the fight. Right? Locomotive. But then, as their muscles tire, the guy's going to need a second wind. So if you look at that fight, we're just talking boxing here. I'm just sharing what I believe is true. I'm not a medical doctor. But as you look at that fight, Joshua comes out. Joshua knocks down Vladimir Klitschko in like the 5th round. Joshua throws a lot of punches. I believe Joshua gets dropped in the 6th or 7th round. Then Joshua is dead on his feet. He's in the corner. Heavyweight history changes in this moment. Vladimir Klitschko must have thought Joshua was just going to fall down like Jerry Cooney did against Larry Holmes. He doesn't up the ante. He lets Joshua recover. He lets Joshua get a second win. Then we get the second half of the fight where Joshua ultimately wins by stoppage. Oscar Duarte in this fight. Folks, the Zone has a habit of allowing you to watch the fight for several days after the fight takes place. Please watch this fight. Oscar Duarte is tired at the end of the 7th round, to the point where Chris Mannix on the telecast tells you what your eyes are seeing. Right? Duarte's in his corner. He's leaned back. He looks spent. Sims has frustrated him that much. And Sims is a guy with only 8 KOs. Also, Duarte may have had a cold. Throughout the fight, Duarte keeps putting his glove up to one nostril and trying to blow out whatever phlegm is in his other nostril. So maybe Duarte, and fighters don't tell you this, maybe Duarte is fighting through illness here. But what we know is Duarte is spent after 7 rounds. Now it's only because he gets a second win, like Joshua did. It's only because he's able to perform well in the championship rounds that he pulls off the fight here. Understand, one judge had it 114-114. Understand the precarious situation Duarte's in. And I thought he won the fight. I actually thought he won the fight by a few rounds. I agreed with Chris Mannix's scorecard. Mannix had him winning the fight by 3 or 4 rounds. Right? But just understand, he's fighting in Chicago against a Chicago fighter. He's fighting in Sims's backyard. Right, folks? Had Duarte not gotten a second win, he could have lost this fight. The scoring could have been different. Right? Understand. One judge had it, I believe, 115-113. Right? The other judge had it a draw. In fact, the scoring suggests that had Sims won the last round, a round Duarte won, the fight would have been a draw. So, I need for folks to scrutinize. Boxing needs to continue to interview Victor Conte. Boxing needs to be vigilant. Because as good as VADA is, folks, it only goes so far. This is not the 1980s with oil-based steroids. Right? This is an era where people understand, look, I don't need more testosterone. What I might need are more red blood cells. Right? What I might need is more oxygen in my blood for the home stretch. Right? People need to focus on that. Right? The drug testers have done a good job catching up with people on HGH. Right? Certainly if you're taking oil-based steroids, you're a fool. Right? But, athletes are figuring out that they can microdose on EPO and Osterin, and it matters in fights where an athlete is spent at the end of the 7th round. Let me say too, This fight didn't have a loser, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to give the casino back its money, right? Duarte delivered. I'm good with that. But Kenneth Sims, more than Duarte, who you knew was tough, right? Kenneth Sims is the revelation here, right? He had a guy throwing over 900 punches. Do the math. Over 12 rounds, right? 900 punches. He had that level of heavy volume, and he survived. And it's not the first fight that he survived against a pressure heavy volume guy, the Akhmedov fight. He did the same thing. Duarte usually comes in at odd angles, right? A little bit off at the side. And it's important because you can't clinch him easily. Several rounds into this fight, the broadcasting team mentioned the fact that there had been no clinches in the fight. Right? But Sims's feet are so good. Folks, he's really a phenomenal foot speed guy. And he's not a dancer. His feet are so good that he kept changing the angles on Duarte. Right? His defense is so good that Duarte eventually had to start going low to get in body shots. And this is a fighter, again, with 8 KOs who's really getting by on slickness. Understand, he threw hundreds less punches than Duarte and yet landed the same amount. His game stayed together. He stayed calm. So 140 is loaded, but let me just say, if you're a back foot guy, if you want to see boxing more than slugging, folks, the 140-pound weight class has no peer. Right? Puello, Richardson Hitchens, Sander Martin, Kenneth Sims. Let me say, too, a great fight. A great fight. It would be a great fight for the boxing connoisseur who just wants to see spectacular boxing. And you could put it on a fight card where you have a meat and potato slugfest fight as the main event, right? Let's say Benavidez against Anthony Yard. I think we know those guys could fight in a phone booth. Right? If I wanted to stylistically mix up a boxing card, one way to do it would be to put Sims, who I rank ahead of Subiel Matias, right? Who they're telling us beat Puello. I thought that fight was edgy and dodgy, right? Puello's the champ. I'm not sure if the challenger did enough in that fight to take the belt, but I believe Sims needs to be in the conversation with fighters who have a higher profile like Subiel Matias, right? Understand, a fight against Shakur Stevenson, and I know Stevenson wants Gervonta Davis. The problem with that is everyone wants Gervonta Davis. Manny Pacquiao wants Gervonta Davis. And if I'm Davis, at this point, it's not about belts. It's about legacy and money, right? Manny Pacquiao brings his crowd with him. That's a bigger payday than many other fights, right? Understand, too, Gervonta Davis already beat Mario Barrios, whose profile has to be raised by his recent draw with Manny Pacquiao, right? Barrios is a title holder at 147. It seems to me that now that he's in his 30s, Gervonta Davis can say, hey, I want dessert. A man I beat is the champ at 147. Who exactly has Brian Norman fought? If I go up to 147, right, I can fight Mario Barrios. That fight sells itself, right? Barrios out for revenge has already dealt with Pacquiao, survived Pacquiao, right? Got the draw, kept his title. is in against Gervonta Davis. You know, the point is, Davis has far more options than Shakur Stevenson. Right? Stevenson, to me, should have jumped to 147. Should have said, hey, Brian Norman, why fight Devin Haney? Fight me. Brother, I'm here. You know, if I'm him, I'm hoping Norman wins that fight because Norman, again, I think Norman is underrated. But Norman doesn't have the names on his resume right now. That's the reality. Right? If I'm Stevenson, I'm that slick dude who realizes I might be too slick for many of these other guys. Right? Stevenson wisely is calling out Teofimo Lopez. Right? I don't think Lopez takes that fight. I think Stevenson's too dangerous. Well, Stevenson against Sims, who's underrated. Right, folks? That's an explosive fight. I mean, Sims just went up against for 12 rounds. Right? A fight that involved the championship rounds. A much heavier puncher. Much heavier puncher than Shakur Stevenson, and looked good in the process. Right? I think, let's just say, I know in the moment, the person who got the opportunity to fight Gary Antoine Russell is Oscar Duarte. Right? Duarte will be fighting for a title. Okay. We understand Duarte is the one who got the W on his record, not Sims. Right? Sims might not realize it because he didn't hear his name called when they announced the winner. But there are a lot of fans like myself who saw his slickness, who saw his survival skills, who saw his composure, who are astonished today by how good he looked. And folks, he looked very good. Right? So I would argue that Sims elevated his profile even more than Oscar Duarte, who had already fought Ryan Garcia, elevated his status. Right, folks? Sims looked great. This was an entertaining fight. The matchup just wasn't good for Sims, simply because Sims is a make-you-miss guy. You have to get through my jab before you get to me guy. Right? He's not a guy who can handle 900 punches thrown at him in 12 rounds with an inordinate amount of power punches. Understand too, Sims is a body huncher. He's a body snatcher. Right? He just happened to be fighting one of boxing's other premier body snatchers. Right? So he couldn't linger in the pocket and just duck his head and go to the body because that would have been playing into Duarte's game. Right? Duarte's trying to linger in the pocket and hit you in the body. Right? Sims had the jab working, folks. It's a beautiful thing, his jab. Right? This is a guy who would give the best at 140 a tough time. Folks, he just gave Oscar Duarte a tough time. Pay close attention to him. Understand, too, Sims had part of his game. He even showed it against Duarte, where he switches to southpaw. Right? Just understand, a pressure fighter will smother that ability. Against a fighter who's not as front foot heavy as Duarte, Sims would be able to exploit those ambidextrous skills the way Terrence Crawford does. Right? Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Duarte looked good, don't get me wrong. The power punches were raining down. That second win gave him the push to win the late rounds that he needed to get the win, including the last round. Right? Just be aware that Sims was magnificent in imposing at times a boxing match on Oscar Duarte? Who's underrated as well? Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.